Alright, so before GB comes up, and I hope everybody knows GB. Everybody knows about you, but I'm not sure you've met everybody. But this time, you met all of them, right? Alright, so when GB comes up, I'll let him introduce himself. But here's sort of, let me set the tone of our evening, okay? Let's begin where every story begins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There is something that we are told in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, and we'll get to that as a church when we are studying Hebrews. But Hebrews 12, 1 to 2, this is what it says. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. In Hebrews 12, 1 to 2, you have a picture. And in that picture, you have witnesses. Right? That sums up, you have an audience in Hebrews 12. You have an author who founds and perfects. You have an author who writes. You have an audience, a witnesses who watch. And you, in that story, in that picture, are the ones who are living the story God is telling. So God writes the story. There are people watching that story. And in Hebrews 12, you are the one living the story that God is telling. So the first verse of the Bible gives us a story. At the very beginning, we are given a story. In fact, in Genesis, the first thing we learn about God's act of creation is that He speaks. When God sort of gets ready to create the world that he pulls up his sleeves, he's going to create the world that he's going to create. The first thing that we know about this God who creates is that he speaks. In fact, all of the world is brought to creation because he tells a story. So I want you to think of Genesis 1 as a picture. If you could imagine it happening, you have a grand storyteller who, as he tells the story, molecules and dust and mountains and lilies of the field all take shape after the story that he is writing. God is a storyteller. He tells stories, and Genesis in the beginning is the story of the creation of the world. And the Bible also tells us not only that God is a storyteller, but the Bible tells us that we are created in His image. We are created in the image of the great storyteller, which means as His image bearers, we too, in one sense, are storytellers. When God says, "Let there be light," photons explode into existence and obedience. They are created and then they obey His words. When He says, "Let the earth bring forth," creation sways according to the rhythms of His poetry. Everything sways and obeys Him. Genesis 1 is not a manufacturing manual. It's not like you've got this world, now you need to understand what this world is. Let's open the instruction manual that tells us the details of what this machinery is. That's not how the Bible writes. That's not how the Bible reads. The Bible is a song. It has a certain rhythm to it. It has refrains in it. And God said, and it was so, and God saw that it was good. All of that gives you a certain rhythm of creation, and it is all a song. The world, in that sense, is not a machine. It's a manuscript. It must be read. Every atom has a specific narrative for which it was written. Every tree, every plant that we have in our balconies, in our yards, is part of a story. It's a part of a story being written. Every morning when you see the sun rise, it rises upon the story of the day. You live in a world that is written by God. You are characters in a divine story. You can't escape the reality of stories. Many people treat the Bible as a collection of disconnected doctrines, moral tips, and inspirational quotes. That's how a lot of people see the Bible. But that's not what the Bible is. It is a single, unified, divinely plotted narrative. It is God's story. It begins in a garden and it ends in a city. It begins with a marriage and it ends with a marriage. It begins with light breaking into darkness and it ends with light obliterating darkness. There's a rhythm to this story. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration, all of it is storyline. In fact, and I'll let Jibby talk more about Lewis and a bit about Tolkien, and we'll get into that. But J.R.R. Tolkien showed C.S. Lewis that the gospel is the true myth. It's a sort of an oxymoron. When you think about myths, they are legends, they are made up tales. But he talks about Christ, the gospel, as the true myth. Right? It is the legend of legends, but it is true. It is the myth that became fact. It is one of the things that sort of spurred his creativity, and it's one of the things that inspired Lewis in his creativity. Right? It is the true myth. Every tale of heroism and sacrifice echoes the tale of true heroism and sacrifice. So every story whispers that there is such a thing as evil and good. But all of it, in one sense, is a reflection of the greater evil and good. And you and I need to realize that the importance of stories comes from the root, the stem, that we live in a story. The importance of stories comes from the fact that Christ came into the world and the author wrote himself into the story. When Jesus put on flesh, when the Word became flesh, he entered the scene. The author became a character and the infinite entered into his own script, his own manuscript, his own paragraph, and told the story of the cross. Everything is a story and you are in that story. You are a character in that story, but you don't get to write it. You don't get to write history. You don't get to rewrite history. You get to live it. You don't hold the ultimate sovereign pen that God has, but God's given you, after his own likeness, the ability to write many stories within this great and grand story that he has created. In Ephesians 2:10, Paul says, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Now, the Greek word for workmanship is poema. It is the word from which we get the English word poem. Now, that's interesting, but it's pretty clear theologically that the intent of Paul was not artistry but workmanship. That's why the English translators write it as workmanship. But for the purposes of our evening, you are God's poem. You are God's workmanship. You are his crafted sentence. You are his chosen word. You are placed exactly where he wants to place you. And because he is the author, and because he is a good author, no line in your life is meaningless. No segment of your story is pointless. No sorrow is pointless. No joy is random. Even the parts of your story that you hate, the pain that you hate, the waiting that you would like to avoid, the confusions that are there in your life, all of those are paragraphs he's writing into your story. There is a reason that Paul is able to say in Romans 8:28 that God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love him. Because that is the picture of a divine author who is above all things. Now, let me sort of from that bring it to us and close it and let Jibby come up. We tell stories because we are made in the image of a storyteller. You can't stop telling stories, even if you wanted to. Every conversation you have, every decision you make, every memory you tell, all of it's narrative. Now we have this evening, and so you go back home and somebody asks what happened this evening, you become a storyteller. You have a dream in the night and you wake up in the morning and you want to tell somebody your dream, you become a storyteller. In fact, it goes even deeper than that. Instinctively, you tell stories. Why? When you forgive, you write a story of grace. When you serve, you write a story of humility. When you repent, you write the story of redemption. Right? Everything that you do is both living the story God is writing, but it is also telling stories. Not just with your mouth, but with your decisions and with your life. You were made as people to live in God's story and to tell stories. There's a reason when I was small and I would watch a lot of Western movies. And I grew up watching a lot of Western movies. And back then, in Western movies, good was good and bad was bad. And a gentleman was always a gentleman. And I wanted, growing up, to be like that gentleman. I wanted my story to look like that story. And I would live my life trying to pretend. Children play pretend. They pretend to be characters in a story. Artists actively imagine stories. Writers instinctively create stories. All of us, one way or another, are inspired by and want to tell stories. So the question is not whether you will tell a story. The question is, what kind of story are you telling? Because whether you like it or not, all of you are telling stories. Now, keep in mind that the devil hates good stories. The devil hates good stories, and that's why he likes telling bad ones. So, God in his story gives instructions, and the devil comes up and he likes to play around, and so he goes, did God really say? Right? The very first temptation is his penetration to vandalize the author, what the author is creating. But he is powerless because he too is a character in God's story. He too is not an author. Ultimately, God still is the author and the devil is only a character. But that doesn't mean he can't do damage, because we need to read good stories and we need to tell good stories. And for every good story that we don't tell, the devil is telling stories to the world. The devil is telling stories to our children. The devil is telling stories to each of us. The stories of battlefields, the stories of love, the stories of loss, the stories of rejection, they all teach us something. They teach us what to love, what to fear, and what to hope for. N.D. Wilson says that stories train the soul's reflexes. That stories train the soul's reflexes. They have a podcast called Stories Are Soul Food. That for our soul, we eat on stories. They prepare us for the fight before we know there's a fight. In fact, if you go back and read the Gospels, there's a reason Jesus speaks in parables. Jesus speaks in parables that confound the intellectual, that confound those who think they are wise, but it blesses the simple, the ones who need to hear his message. The devil tells godless, cynical, hollow stories that makes holiness look dull, that makes sin look beautiful. He feeds the world with epics of rebellion where man is the hero and God is the villain. And you see these stories everywhere around you. In fact, this whole world is it's a war between good and bad stories. And everybody is storytelling. And you need to know what your imagination should be full of. What stories are you going to eat and what stories are you going to tell? And that's why we have great stories written by godly men from across centuries that are good. And we have great stories written by secular men as well, who have to sort of borrow from our Christian worldview to write the stories that they write. And so men like Tolkien and Lewis are men who give us good stories. And I want to introduce them sort of because most of us in this room have not read either Tolkien or Lewis. And we are not much of readers. And so that's sort of why we're having this session. You have to know that when you read, for example, if you read Tolkien, who was a Christian, and Tolkien had very clear intentions behind some of the things he wrote. When Frodo takes the ring in the Lord of the Rings, we learn the burden of obedience. When Gandalf faces the Balrog, we see the cost of sacrifice, and when he returns, we see the hope of resurrection. When Aragorn returns as the true king, we glimpse the rider on the white horse, faithful and true. Everything has a certain picture to it. Yeah, there's a part where Samwise Gamgee tells Frodo, "I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you," and that is Galatians 6:2. Bear one another's burdens. All these stories sort of are automatically reflecting certain things, and when they reflect the Christian worldview, when they reflect God's ultimate story, because all our short, small stories are reflecting off of God's grand design. If we reflect off of that giant blueprint and we tell our own stories, they will all point to God at the end of the day. They will all point to God's ultimate story. There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. We need to read stories like that and understand what the characters did in those stories so we can emulate them. Let me close with Philippians 4:8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Right? Now that's a huge, giant, wide, broad sort of instruction by Paul. But here's one way you can apply it. Read stories that are true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable, and excellent. And think about them. Because they all point to Christ. They all point ultimately to heaven. And one day, the grand storyteller will finish his story. God will end his story. And at the end, when he writes to the end of his story, when he says the end, we know that it will be the beginning of the next story. That God is going to write a next story. And Lewis, if you've read Narnia, Lewis in the last battle, in the last book of Narnia, closes the story of Narnia this way, where he says all their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story. Because now they were going to cross into the great story. When Narnia was concluded and they're going to enter, which no one on earth has ever read, a story no one on earth has ever read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before it. So God will end this story and begin a new one in eternity. And there we will be for eternity living and worshipping and rejoicing a great and glorious story that has no end. So until that day, live well in the story that God is writing. Read good stories, tell better ones, write with your life what God has written in your heart, in your soul. And never forget that the author who began this good work will finish it. He will finish it. And so the storyteller who once wrote himself into the story will one day write you into everlasting joy. And so that's the hope that we have. So stories from the Bible and out from the Bible into the life that we live, all of it around us are full of stories. And so brothers, if you're not reading stories, if you're not reading books, now is the time to start. Because it will really change the way you live your life today. All right.